So this is going to be a live react to this video by Geddie. Liberal populism is a feature of the Democratic Party. Geddie seems like a cool guy. I mean, he's like pretty progressive for a liberal, but he has like a solid head on his shoulders. And this is an interesting conversation because I would argue the opposite, that populism it can't be the future of the Democratic Party, because two populist parties, it's just a road to nowhere unless the leadership is just using populism as a shield and not actually following through on populist promises. But let's see what he says in this video.
For a certain kind of liberal, the worst thing you can be in the whole world is a populist.
The populism in the West.
Why do we see a rise of populism?
Whether or not this style of politics is ethical, it's certainly democratic, and it goes by the name of populism.
I think liberals have become too afraid of populism, and it's actually destroying us. An excessive fear of appearing populist denies the long history of liberals from the very beginning, making populist appeals in order to achieve liberal ends. It confuses a style of politics.
This is true, but again, like it's complicated. One, populism throughout the ages has changed quite a lot. The most famous example, probably, of the liberal populist who got very, very powerful was like Jackson, or later LBJ. But the populism of those times was all in the, for Jackson, it was before the development of the administration state through Wilson, and for LBJ, it's a very different sort of populism than what we're talking about now. But let's see what he means by this.
Politics for the substance of politics. It makes liberals talk and act like elitists. It puts Democrats in danger of missing some.
Also, I really hope he defines populism in this video, because that in itself is part of the confusion, where populist seems to just mean variations of uplifting the common man into the halls of power, but it's not really clear like what people mean by that oftentimes, and there seems to be very conflicting accounts of that, even intra-party, even among people on the right or the left who are self-described populists. So I hope he defines what he means by that.
Opportunities this election season, and frankly, an excessive fear of sounding like populists prevents liberals from speaking honestly about our current political situation. So lots to cover, but first, what even is populism? Populism is a funny word. It's applied to people across the ideological spectrum, from Bernie Sanders to Donald Trump and lots of others too. The short answer is that populism is a kind of politics that aims to represent the interests of average people against a controlling or elite class. How exactly the people and the elite are defined is what makes the difference between—
It's a very like poli-sci textbook definition, but I mean, it's serves its purpose.
Different kinds of populism: leftist populism, right-wing authoritarian populism, etc., etc. The key here is that populism itself is not an ideology. It's a style of politics that can be applied to really almost any kind of ideology. But one ideology that's almost never associated with populism today is liberalism. You never hear anyone talk about liberal populism.
The problem is that you can say it's not ideological, but populism, generally speaking, implies a democratic process, and a very direct democratic process, which is why there's sometimes debates, even like historically, about like, can the country like America even be populist, because we have a Republican structure that has democratic channels, but it doesn't really. There's a lot of barriers in place to prevent the common man from representing himself. Instead, he has to seek representation through these distant people, oftentimes, and increasingly distant too. And some of our structures, like the Senate, are they are intentionally abstract to keep the common man kind of away from things he doesn't understand or whatever. So it's fine.
So much the case that you'll sometimes hear liberals speak about populism as if it's an ideology directly opposed to liberalism, or at least mutually exclusive with liberalism. This clip of Derek Thompson—
because generally speaking, it's against institutionalism that is now associated with liberalism, like the Wilson administrative state, or the deep state, as people call it now. Like, the populists are generally against that, and the problem is the deep state is the sort of like great cathedral that American liberalism has built, that used to be not necessarily bipartisan, but deployed and embraced by both parties. So that's why it's seen as being against liberalism, is because the liberalism that the sort of uniparty structure that people referred to, going back to neocons and neolibs and before, it's antagonistic against that. So that's why it's seen as antagonistic against liberalism, because it definitionally almost always is against American liberalism. Yeah.
Thompson, co-author of Abundance with Ezra Klein, is one example of what I'm talking about here.
If the lens of corporate power leads to both some very good ideas and some not very good ideas, then it might not be the single best lens through which to see improving America. I am not a populist. I am a liberal.
Now, he's saying populism to mean left-wing populism there, but here's the economist pitching populism
as— It's important, too, is he's referring to corporate power, so he's talking in the confines of economic populism, which is very, very different than the broader sort of populism that you see in like the DSA, which is much more talking about the state itself, not just the economic balancing the state does, the limitations of market control or whatever, but actually restructuring the state to be more democratic.
The fundamental challenge to liberalism today using right-wing examples.
In recent years, populist movements have attacked the liberal cause.
It's a pretty common theme. The anxiety about populism of all stripes runs very deep in the liberal popular consciousness. If you're in this space at all, I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about. Liberalism is an ideology committed to things like freedom, equality, brotherhood, fraternity, as the French put it, and the rule of law. Given all that, is there anything in liberalism that prevents us from making populist...
The rule of law part is really important because the liberal version of rule of law, it is implying a very strict sense of elitism in the sense that the way that you can wager against countries that are monarchies or aristocracies, that you're still deploying an elite that oversees that rule of law, because the reality is the people will descend into chaos. That's why populism is seen negatively in the extreme sense in the American tradition, because it's seen as antagonistic against the rule of law, because it seeks to change the rule of law. It seeks to make things more in accordance with mob rule rather than fundamental principles, generally speaking. Oh.
appeals. I know one man who didn't think so. A little over 250 years ago, one of the great liberals in history, Thomas Paine, wrote in his most famous work, Common Sense, that one honest man is worth more than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived. I think that's just about as populist as you can get in 1776. In that spirit, let's move beyond liberalism's birth in the Age of Enlightenment and consider another time that liberalism was in crisis.
Economic royalists carved new dynasties. New kingdoms were built upon concentration of control over material things. Through new uses of corporations and banks and securities, new machinery of industry and agriculture, of labor and capital, all undreamed of by the fathers, the whole structure of modern life was impressed into this royal service.
Of course, that was FDR at his 1936 Democratic Convention speech. FDR is responsible for liberalism gaining its modern associations in the United States, and he was very populist. His populism also helps to broaden the scope of what liberals believed could be possible. He extended the ideas of the American Revolution by pointing out that people who are desperately poor are not really meaningfully free, especially relevant for our current situation where the illiberal right...
This is again where I think that the context matters so much when comparing it to contemporary notions. Like, there's a really good book that people should read. It's Letters from the Forgotten Man, where it categorizes, it's just basically a bunch of different examples of letters that people wrote to FDR, where a lot of these guys literally were talking to FDR like he was the only person in the world who cared about them. But what's important about like reading those letters is like you get a real indication of what poverty meant in the Great Depression. It meant like you're rationing as a town lard as your primary caloric source. It meant that you had people who hadn't had jobs in actual years. And a lot of the populism that FDR was deploying was populism that was oriented against fascism and communism. Something that people forget too is that there was a real concern about the economic conditions of the Depression causing a fascist or communist revolution in America and overthrowing the government. So like when we go back to like the FDR Make Work programs, like these are not the most economically sound programs. They might have even created greater lengths for the Depression, but they were deployed because it was super important to get people working, to make them feel like they were part of a community, to make them feel like they were patriotic. If you didn't do that, then you would have this a real risk of them turning to fascism, returning to Marxist-Leninism. So it was populism, but it was populism in such an extraordinary circumstance, and in a lot of ways, it was betraying that message. FDR governed as much as a Caesar as he could. He was trying to curb the entire government into fitting this New Deal, being able to unilaterally rule and to keep things on a path that was sort of defined by him and his elite insiders. Like, in certain ways, it's appealing to populist sentiment, but it was, again, like I'm going to keep repeating this, it was a continuation of the Wilsonian project. It was a continuation of a building up of the administrative state. It was a continuation of creating and grooming a deep state apparatus. So, like, again, like the messaging was populist, but it was populist messaging for a time that necessitated it due to material circumstances. I don't think that's the time we have right now. Populist messaging is important, but it's thoroughly divorced from material circumstances. It's the entire reason why the term vibe session became so popular, because you had people talking like it was the Great Depression during the Biden admin, when those same people were, generally speaking, doing pretty well for themselves economically and had never had better material circumstances in every domain aside from housing. And even then, it didn't mean you had this mass contingency of unhoused people, but rather people who may have still been renting when they wanted to, at that point in their life, buy a house. Like, it's a totally different problem. So I feel like calling upon these classic examples, and that's a bit of a tangent, but I think it illustrates that, like, when you call upon these examples, like, it has to be more substantial than just saying, look at this time this messaging was used, and look how it changed the country in some ways that might be populist, when the substance of why those things were said and what actually changed kind of cuts against what contemporary populism is, which is first and foremost opposition towards a deep state entangled elite.
Brazenly cooperates globally to try and undermine democratic societies. FDR also understood what he was doing as an effort to push back against global tyranny.
We are fighting to save a great and precious form of government for ourselves and for the world.
Keep in mind that in June 1936, when this speech was given, the Olympics was about to be held in Hitler's Berlin. Mussolini was in power in Italy. The Spanish Civil War, which would eventually be won by Franco's fascists, was a month away from breaking out, and Stalin was in power in the USSR. This isn't even to mention the economic calamity of the Great Depression. Things looked worse at this moment for liberal democracy and the cause of global freedom than they have looked at any time since. If Thomas Paine and FDR weren't too good for populism, why are so many liberals today? The answer is going to sound familiar to those of you who have seen my Ezra Klein video. This is sort of a spiritual successor to that video, you can probably tell. But I'm going to make a condensed version of the argument that I made there right now. Around the 90s, a lot of things happened at around the same time that really influenced liberalism in the United States as we know it today. First, liberal candidates had been getting beat bad for like 20 years by a re-energized conservative movement, and then Democrats were saved from electoral oblivion by a guy who talked like this.
The era of big government is over. The old labels of liberal and conservative, spender and cutter, even Democrat and Republican, are not what matter most anymore. What matters most is finding practical, pragmatic solutions based on what we know works in our lives and our shared experiences, so that we can go forward together as a nation. Ideological purity is for partisan extremists.
Second, the fall of the Soviet Union produced a feeling that the last fundamentally different from liberal democracy form of government had failed. Fascism was gone, now communism had failed. The battle would now be essentially between progressives and conservatives within a broad frame.
And also, much more importantly, and this is kind of why I think this context matters, like, part of the reason why Reagan and then eventually Clinton is this trajectory that we're seeing, this move away from populism, is largely because the question stopped being at scale, what can the government do for me? Or what can the government do more for me? And why isn't the government doing what it's set out to do? Part of the reason why third way Democrats were able to take over after the failures of the Reagan administration, but also because of the successes, is because it stopped being about growing the state. It became about seeking to have the state function in a way that would be appropriate, in a way that would be acceptable, in that it has to do well what it's already set out to do. This could be for things like when the dissatisfaction with public schools, or with the development of certain federal systems that had been in place for a long time, but not actually seeing results that were supposed to be seen. That calls for a different kind of steady hand than the radicalism of populism. And then when that does become necessary, you see it pop up. That's part of the reason why Obama's language became much more populist when it came to healthcare, because that is where people wanted to see the state expand. They wanted to see the state do more. They wanted to see a radical change with it. This is all still very different from the sort of populism today, which has nothing to do with any of those conflicts, I think.
Framework called liberal democracy.
Well, on the left more so, but definitely on the right, it has nothing to do with those. The left a little bit with healthcare.
Trying to explain exactly what liberal democracy is could probably be a whole other video on its own, but it basically means a system of government that combines a certain level of democracy, representation for the people, with a certain level of guaranteed rights for individuals. A lot of liberal leaders and intellectuals had come to believe that the essential point of liberalism was the management of consensus among these competing factions within liberal democracy. And liberalism itself actually should not really engage at all with the more fundamental questions like what is a good life and stuff like that. In this conception of liberalism is not really a player in the ideological game. It's more like the referee. The problem, of course, is nobody goes to the game.
That's missing a really critical part there. and maybe if it's in Europe post-war, I understand his version of liberalism a bit more. Liberal democracy in America definitely has a conception of the good life, but it's much more concerned with like the good life being something that is self-achieved, and that liberalism provides you the failures or the ability to fail. Like, go back to the founding fathers, go back to the pre-colonial or pre-revolution America. Like, people were obsessed with antiquity. They're obsessed with Rome. They're obsessed with this notion of cultivation of virtue, of the good life, of the ethical life. To say that Americans did not and didn't develop with an understanding of what was good, like the good, it's just not true. And it's more that like we developed a system where we believe the best way to achieve the good is to allow people to claw at it with their own two hands and to not be encumbered by the state. And part of that necessitates the ability to fail and to fall and to slide. And then you get into more, this is a very different video kind of, it goes past the scope of this video. You get into different things too, where like the American liberal democratic conception of liberty comes from this like, European or Anglo notion of rights being tied to the ownership of property or the capacity to own property and all this stuff. So it's more than that. It's a lot more than that. But like on a fundamental level, it's not just semantics, not just like whatever. And I think that's kind of why there's a bit of a disconnect here with like the goals of populism.
To root for the referee. Which brings us finally to today's crisis within liberalism. Those three factors produced a generation of liberals, the journalists, the politicians, the intellectuals leading the movement today, who believed at some level that the essence of liberalism was technocratic tinkering. Those more fundamental questions like, are all men created equal, and should we have a state religion, or should we have a market economy, appeared to no longer be seriously under debate. For a moment, maybe this was true, but it's not true anymore. A right wing that wants to turn America into a pastiche European blood and soil state with Christian cryptocurrency characteristics is in power. It turns out that those more fundamental questions weren't as closed as we thought they were, and I think
part of the issue of that too is that I think like that is still a question in the sense that you have a very unique coalition under Donald Trump right now because it's a cult of Trump and he carries along a lot of personalities with them. But like, does Hegseth represent a large constituent of the Republican Party? And by that, I mean like a coalition that would be at least 40% of the voters. I don't think so. Like, I think things are not. I think a lot of the ideologies you get to see play in the Trump White House right now are not necessarily representative of large amounts of of the Republican Party, but rather they're these extremist sides that are willing to be loyal to Donald Trump, and they're not too concerned about what happens afterwards. They're just trying to make their gains now. I don't know. Is that what's happening right now? Maybe it is. Maybe there's something I'm missing, but I don't know.
There's a lot of liberals who look back at a pre-Trump era of more perceived, at least elite agreement about these more fundamental questions and clearly see one thing to blame for bringing it all to an end: populism. Donald Trump in the US, Brexit in the UK, Le Pen in France, the AfD in Germany, and the recently ousted Viktor Orban of Hungary, pitching a model of explicitly illiberal democracy and trying incredibly hard to make this into a global thing with the NatCon movement. Liberals all over the place were struggling to deal with the rise of a particular kind of right-winger, I think in need of a way to explain.
I think this is also a little bit of a weird consolidation. Like, you have very, at this point, I would say, extreme, like structural issues in a lot of Europe that you don't have in America. Like, America's immigration issues are largely fabricated in terms of like the messaging or whatever. But like in Europe, you do have like a welfare state that is on the precipice of disaster in like a dozen countries. You do have really bad economic growth. You do have really, really rough, cultural disagreements between different migrant groups and civilian and native populations. Like, those things are real. Like, it's a little different, I think. And this is what I mean, where there has to be like these substantial differences need to be teased out, where I think that the right-wing populism that's growing in Europe is clearly getting a lot of legitimacy and energy from the MAGA populism in America, but they're not the same thing.
What made these people different from just plain old right-wingers. People settled on populist because it captured the anti-establishment character of these movements. The populist label had extra appeal because it also seemed to...
And again, just not to harp on it too much, but like in Europe, again, part of the reasons why is because you're seeing really strong material failures that are coming from the establishment status quo. In America, the whole joke of MAGA is that you can be right, left, whatever. Everyone has to acknowledge, if you're in a fact-based world, that the MAGA critiques of the establishment are almost all divorced from fact and reality. Like, it isn't true that illegal immigration under Biden was causing the problems that like material problems, economic problems, and job placement problems that people like Trump or his coalition claim they were. In fact, it was the opposite in that, if you'll forget, like, you know, COVID unemployment or post-COVID unemployment was so low, dangerously so, that there were large swaths of the economy that desperately needed work and they could not raise wages while staying in business. Like, this is the difference. Like, populism that comes from material issues, populism that comes from an establishment that is failed and actively still failing, is not the same thing as what's occurring in America. I would say, with the exception being the UK, that the Labour government absolutely does seem to be course correcting pretty well in a lot of ways, and they're not getting credit for it. But that's it's all of that anger and resentment came from an establishment Tory, you know, constituency that ruled for 14 years that failed horrifically. So
as of people like Bernie Sanders to a new level of importance around the same time that Trump burst onto the scene. Being able to talk about unserious populists on the left and the right allowed liberals to retain the comfortable position of umpire in the game of politics, calling balls and strikes, as the favorite phrase of a particular kind of centrist goes. In addition to all the other problems I have with turning liberalism into a weird, bloodless, without a moral core version of itself, which I talk about a lot in the Ezra Klein video, I think the populist label here ultimately confuses a style of politics for...
I'm not trying to disagree with Geddie here either. I actually think it's an interesting question. I've always wondered, what is the answer for people like this if you don't have a more conservative bent? Like, what do you want liberalism to take the identity of? Because it's like it's almost a joke where, like, they are acknowledging the same problem that Schmidt brings up in his Concept of Political, where he argues that liberalism doesn't have a politics. It's almost like a politics of negation itself. But, like, for guys like this, that's supposed to be the strength. I don't know why you have to accept that as a problem, but whatever.
The substance of politics. Donald Trump is a populist in the sense that he pitches himself as a champion of the common man against a corrupt elite. But this, on its own, is obviously not the reason why Donald Trump is so bad. Trump is bad because he is illiberal. He wants to make this country less free. He wants to make this country less equal. He's trying to replace the ideals of the Declaration of Independence that bind us together.
I guess there'll just be like a point of disagreement between us. Like, I think the problem with Trump is that he's stupid. That's like the bigger issue. Like, you could have a really corrupt Trump still with all the illiberal tendencies, but if he wasn't dumb, at the very least, like, there's something to salvage at the end of it. But, like, the destruction that we have currently is because Trump is just someone who's not political. He's a dumb person who is very, very personally motivated and vindictive. So, like, the destruction of our foreign policy, the destruction of our economy, like, these are all things that are happening because he is stupid. But, like, Trump himself isn't very political. I think, like, he's not, like, he wants to undo American liberal democracy, but not because he's like an ideologue, but because liberal democracy impedes his ability to be corrupt. Like, that's the bad part. That's why he's uniquely bad. That's why people will say that he is like even worse than some of the dictators of Europe, because, like, at the very least there's like a competency and there's something to pick up afterwards. But, like, what will there be to pick up after Trump? Like, who knows?
With a blood and soil definition of what it means to be an American, and he obviously does not believe in the rule of law. His administration and his court philosophers are against all the things that we support. The thing that makes Trump different from previous iterations of the Republican Party isn't that he's vulgar. We can deal with vulgar people. It's not that he throws red meat to the base. Every politician does this to a degree.
Drug and human smuggling, home invasions, murder.
We're outmanned. Of all the illegals in America, more than half come through Arizona.
Have we got the right plan?
Plan's perfect. You bring troops, state, county, and local law enforcement together.
And complete the dang fence.
It'll work this time. Senator, you're one of us.
I'm John McCain, and I approve this message.
What's different about Trump is he is making his populist appeals against the fundamentals of American liberal democracy. I think because liberals have lost some sense of themselves as more than just the referee, because a lot of liberals...
Like, is he, though? I feel like this is the issue, too, where it's like the Trump issue is it's almost like post-political. Like, how much of Trump's rhetoric is connected to political fundamentals? How much of his base is even thinking about political fundamentals? I feel like we just take those things for granted now. Like, they're not even discussed because they're too high concept. I don't even think people have a conception of, like, why, you know, the right to trial is important for people, why freedom is important in, like, a real abstract, nonpartisan sense. Like, politics, like, in the Trump camp does not seem like politics generally. It's primarily like media. It's like a reality TV show. It's like sketch comedy almost. Like, I don't know if that's what Trump is selling. Maybe it's the end result of what he's selling, but is it actually what he is selling with his language?
don't like to think of themselves as especially ideological people, because a lot of us identify with institutions and norms instead of the principles we build these institutions and norms to advance. We've identified the enemy as populism when the enemy is really illiberalism, and these are not the same thing. Now, I want to address immediately one criticism that I know is coming, which is that populism is inherently illiberal because it's about essentially lying or exaggerating the truth in order to win. I'm going to play another clip.
I will say, whoever says that stuff, that's not stupid. That's not true. You can be truthful while being a populist, but generally speaking.
Clip of Derek Thompson
and liberal while being a populist.
I'm at Welcome Fest, which is a conference put on by Welcome, a centrist Democrat group.
If you and I were like running in a primary, and you said that, you said the far right has a story and they've won. The far left has a story. The center doesn't have a story, and that's a problem. What I would say in response to that is, yeah, stories are for children. Americans need a plan. Americans need solutions. Now, backing out of that, what I just did is also storytelling, right? It is essentially saying, like, the story that I would tell is essentially that American politicians, in some categories, have fallen too in love with this idea that you don't have an agenda until you have a story. No, you can have an agenda. You can just have the answers. You can just have a plan to make people's lives better, and you don't necessarily have to wrap it up in a complex story that, like, belittles elites or finds...
I would say that the fundamental problem with this is that, and this is what the Democrats have fallen into time and time again, if you make someone's life easier, if they don't, like, think you did that, if they don't realize that, none of it matters. Like, the ACA tax credit extensions did not help Biden. You know, it made people's life a lot easier, but it didn't matter because they couldn't connect the dots of the storytelling. They needed the narrative.
Bad guy, or says, you know, if a company gets relatively big, it's always evil. You don't have to lie to people to win elections.
So I think this is really interesting. What's being advanced here pretty explicitly is that liberals should tell a story about not telling a story, that we should double down on the framing of liberalism as an essentially non-ideological thing. And we should do this, tell a story about not telling a story, because there's something inherently dishonest about doing anything else. Doing anything else would be lying to people like Trump lies to people. There's a few problems with this that I want to address. First, you can't escape the ideological content of liberalism. You just can't.
Before we get into this, I want to repeal like Geddie, think about this. Like, I think fundamentally what Thompson's describing itself is a failure. It doesn't make sense. It's not about a left and a right and then the center. It's that there's two parties, and one party is unified around one person, and another party is a bunch of random factions that have no unity. And even at the administration level, like, are Schumer and Jeffries, like, is there something like that connects them, really? Like, at least at the House, you had Pelosi, who had a strong stranglehold over the House itself. But, like, what is the Democratic Party? It's still a question where it's like people like Thompson shouldn't be Democrats on paper. They should be Republicans in the traditional, or at least 21st century sense of the word. But because Trump has retold the Republican Party, the Democratic Party is this schizophrenic, like, garble of nothingness where somehow people like Thompson and Tom Piker are in the same party, comfortably so. Like, that's the issue, is that, like, what is getting confused for narratives. Like, narratives are problematic, but narratives arise naturally in politics. But you need unity. You need a, like, real movement. You need something that's, like, concrete. And not concrete in deliverables, concrete in what you are doing together. But you have shared goals. I don't think any of the factions in the Democratic Party have shared fundamentals or shared goals in the absolute sense. Like, maybe they'll have points where they overlap, but they're different entities all trying to work in the same political structure because no one wants to take the risk of trying to work outside of it, and everyone thinks they can take it over. So, it's a weird, like, it feels like we have to create these problems, like, of narratives or whatever, because we're fundamentally trying to ignore the fact that the Democratic Party does not make sense. It doesn't, like, make sense as a group of people politically right now.
Do it. No matter how hard you try, you can't just have the answers, as Derek Thompson put it, because we don't all even agree on the problems that we're trying to solve. We don't all even agree on what the questions are. Take Derek's point about making the essentials of life more affordable. I totally agree with that, by the way. But what do you do with someone who just denies that making life easier and happier with cheaper stuff is a good thing? Let's consider the vice president as an example.
So let's talk a little bit about what we believe in the Republican Party. We believe that 1 million cheap knockoff toasters aren't worth the price of a single American manufacturing job.
Now, this is kind of a funny clip because he's trying to do an applause line about toasters, which is inherently a little bit humorous. But what he's actually saying is an explicit rejection of the idea that what matters fundamentally is making things cheaper and easier. He's rejecting the entire premise. And I want to be absolutely clear. That is not all that people want in life. People don't just want things to be cheaper and easier. And it's a mistake to pretend that this is all liberalism is about. If we tell people that liberalism is just about things being cheaper, we're not going to have anything to say whenever someone comes around, denies the premise, and says, actually, I don't think Americans just want things to be cheaper and easier. I think they want struggle, danger, self-sacrifice, and death. That's not a hypothetical. That's from George Orwell's review of Mein Kampf. So what do you do whenever you're faced with a powerful anti-liberal movement based around a narrative that isn't just denying that narratives matter or that things beyond the material actually matter to people? What you do is what FDR actually did, what Thomas Paine actually did, what Abraham Lincoln actually did. When Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address, he said that this nation was conceived in liberty, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He told a story about how the Civil War was a continuation of the founding. He told a story about soldiers fighting and dying so that a government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. That is a story defending liberal principles.
I think the problem with something like this, though, is that, like, the story emerges from, like, the actual content, like the actual, like, fighting, or the actual war, like the things that people are living. You have to create a story, like, again, this is what I mean, where it comes about almost, where it's organic. You can't just, like, craft a narrative that no one connects with.
Is it a lie? Certainly, plenty of people say it is. I live in Texas, and I've heard people call the Civil War the War of Northern Aggression. I'm sure we've also all heard critiques of the American founding on the grounds that it was actually not, in fact, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. But no, telling this story isn't lying to people. It's what, I hope anyway, liberals really believe about this country, of the people, by the people, for the people. I hope we actually believe that. I actually believe that. And anyway, we shouldn't condescend to people and call them children for believing in something. Remember earlier, whenever I was talking about how the problem with illiberal populists isn't the populism, it's the illiberalism? We can apply that same logic to the idea of telling.
Like, this is the issue too, where it's like, I would rather live in a well-managed and high quality of life illiberal country than a country that is declining, low quality, corrupt, whatever, but it's like populism with like liberal characteristics. It's just, this is the issue where it's like liberalism isn't good because it's liberalism. Liberalism is good because it perseveres, because it demonstrates itself, that it creates like countries worth living in. That's why it's good.
Telling stories filled with lies. Stories are necessary in politics. The bad part about telling stories filled with lies, like the Trump administration does, is the lying. Lying is not an inherent part of storytelling, just like illiberalism is not an inherent part of populism. If you want people to care about your policies, you have to explain to people first why they should care. That's the story part. For a long time, liberals could ignore this part of politics because there was broad agreement, at least at the...
But what part of this has to do with populism? Like, if you have a policy that's not populist, you can still tell a story with it. Why is that liberal populism? This is the part I'm trying to see the connection on. Maybe he explains it somewhere here.
Elite level about those fundamentals that I talked about earlier, like who is an American? We don't have that level of consensus anymore.
A man wrote me and said, you can go to live in France, but you cannot become a Frenchman. You can go to live in Germany or Turkey or Japan, but you cannot become a German, a Turk, or Japanese. But anyone from any corner of the earth can come to live in America and become an American. Yes, the torch of Lady Liberty symbolizes our freedom and represents our heritage, the compact with our parents, our grandparents, and our ancestors. It is that lady who gives us our great and special place in the world.
We were told that the entire meaning of America boiled down to a few lines in a poem on the Statue of Liberty and 5 words about equality in the Declaration of Independence. The outnumbered Kentucky settlers repelling wave after wave of Indian warband attacks from beyond the stockade walls. All of them will be astonished to hear that they were only fighting for a proposition. They believed they were fighting for a nation, a homeland for themselves and their descendants. They fought, they bled, they struggled, they died for us. They built this country for us. America, in all its glory, is their gift to us, handed down across the generations. It belongs to us. It's our birthright, it's our heritage, our destiny. If America is everything and everyone, then it is nothing and no one at all.
There's a few people that I'd like to talk about who are very...
I really, really dislike when very progressive liberals use that Reagan quote, or that Reagan speech, or or actually Reagan said similar things several times, but there's 2 elements that are really frustrating, and that contrast did not help with this. If you know what you're looking for, but a lot of people don't know there's a hand waving that goes on with this. It's just a fact that the country is becoming less and less culturally hegemonic. It's just true. You have a much more diverse country right now than you did in Reagan's time, and especially in the childhood of Reagan voters. So like when you think about the type of average voter that Reagan had in their 40s, they're in a country that is, generally speaking, pretty ethnically hegemonous, similar culture, similar religion, less movement than people expect. And the greater issue was the struggle of black racism. And the reality is these are people who are also heritage Americans in that sense. They've been around for a while, whatever. That is very, and then it's also cast in the Cold War, where we're thinking about ourselves much more as a first versus second world environment. So that then contrasts against now, which it just is true. Like, demographics have changed a lot. It's very unsettling for people. It's whatever. You can think it's wrong. You can disagree with that, but you have to acknowledge that difference. You have to, because otherwise you're never going to be able to just come on top. You're never going to be able to seem reasonable to people you're trying to win over, because it just seems like you're dodging the question. Like, a lot of people would just immediately say, yeah, go back to the American demographics of Reagan's era, and sure, I'd agree with him. Like, that's just the issue. Like, until you address things like that, it feels very weird to then just try to put a blanket on a fire and hope it'll work. Like, maybe it will. It hasn't worked so far. And then using that to connect to I don't know, whatever.
Very good at telling a populist liberal story.
Now, you remember we were told that MAGA was for working class Americans. You remember that? But this is a government of, by, and for the ultra rich. It is the wealthiest cabinet ever. This is the Epstein class ruling our country. They are the elites they pretend to hate.
That's Jon Ossoff. You might recognize him from his YouTube ads asking you to donate to his campaign. He's a strange politician for this era because he shows up every once in a while, delivers a fantastic speech, makes the news everywhere, gets clips everywhere, and then you don't see him again until he does the same thing a month later. He's one of the only politicians right now that I think is known for his speeches. What I find especially interesting about Ossoff, in addition to his speeches and his populist rhetoric, is that he has a very strong sense of liberal principles.
I listened to a speech a few months back by a senator from Missouri who's aligned with the president, and I think what I heard him say was that the only real Americans are those descended from the original European settlers. Now maybe he forgot the Mayflower itself was full of religious exiles fleeing persecution. But our heritage isn't limited to that of the Pilgrims and those who settled the West. America's heritage...
Yeah, and this is all good. Is this part populist? I don't know. It's right. It's a great talking point, and it's accurate. One of the easy, ways you can strike down the heritage American BS is that, it is just true. America is itself this vestige of weird religious extremism, of bizarre, outcasts of different European ethnicities. Again, it bears repeating that people in America of, before did not think about all Western Europeans in the same way, and had very, very, aggressive views about different nationalities. I mean, just, we've made movies about this that are relatively grounded in sentiment, that Scorsese film or whatever. That's all true, and also does a good job at promoting that. But this part isn't populism. This is just kind of meat and potatoes liberalism with a guy who can speak well, who represents traditional, masculine aesthetics. I don't know if this connects.
Includes the descendants of slaves who won liberation from slavery and Jim Crow. It includes the Creek Indians who lived in Middle Georgia for 11 centuries straight.
None of this necessitates the weird Epstein class stuff. That's the issue I have, where it's he doesn't have to say anything like this.
It includes immigrants from every region.
He doesn't have to say anything like this to connect to the Epstein stuff. I understand why he's both work, but this isn't populism. I don't think.
Continent who arrived here fleeing persecution or seeking opportunity. Americans are not a race. We're a people. United not by ethnicity, but by shared convictions, and that is what makes us exceptional and a beacon to the world.
Yeah. Let's take a look at another message, this time coming from my home state of Texas.
The biggest divide in our country is not left versus right. It's top versus bottom.
Now, unlike Ossoff, Tallarico is an actual populist, but also this guy has the problem of populist where it's what is he? He's a total enigma. Anyone of that original woke era who said some wild stuff and now is trying to rebrand, these people shouldn't be a part of the party. It's ridiculous. Again, you should vote for this guy because he's the representative. But this is what I mean, where it's I don't even know what populism means at this point, where it's like, is it just supposed to appeal? Like, are you just saying we should have shapeshifters in the party? If so, yeah, I agree. Of course, that would be good to have better shapeshifters. But like, do we want actual populism? Do we want actually following through on that stuff?
Want us looking left and right at each other so that we're not looking up at them.
Tallarico is clearly making populist messaging part of his campaign. Does this make him a worse liberal? Absolutely not. If Tallarico or Ossoff...
Just to be clear, it does make him a worse liberal if he follows through on populist policy. That's the issue.
Or anyone else is able to use populist messaging to build popular support for liberal principles, I say more power to them. Because in the end, liberalism and liberal institutions depend on the people.
I think this is where I primarily have a problem in this video, where it's like, you're saying earlier on, you don't have to lie like Donald Trump to be a populist. It's not part of making a narrative. But then you're talking about people who, like Ossoff and Tallarico, I hope they're lying, in the sense that like the economic populism that they are pointing towards is policy-wise just bad. Like, it is not good. There's a reason why it doesn't take off with the technocratic wonks or whatever, and it's because it's ill-advised and or meaningless, as in there's no policy affront. Like, there's no policy to attack the Epstein class, and when you don't deliver on that, like, people will be mad. You're just giving more power to the right. So it's like a short-term solution if it even works. So if lying doesn't make you a good populist, is the prescription that we should be coming up with policy to attack the Epstein class or whatever, and that people like Tallarico and Ossoff should be the forebearers of that? Like, it's just a very confused message.
The support of the people, the virtue of the people. In the end, the Bill of Rights is a piece of paper if people don't actually believe in it. I want to touch on one more thing that's been bothering me about the state of liberal discussion, which is the feeling I get sometimes that a lot of liberals kind of think that people are ungovernable, unimprovable hogs. And worse, this feeling seems to be what attracts some people to liberalism. Probably the most notorious example of someone like this is Richard Hanania, who is a writer that I've seen pop up a lot lately in liberal adjacent spaces, mostly for his critiques of the right.
I really don't like I don't like Hanania in general, but I really hate using him as an example of someone who is this like elitist liberal. He is not. He is a very, very like sick, ill, like anarcho-capitalist type, or as close as you can get, where he is always thinking about like competency and what does better economically. He is not compelled by principles. He is not compelled by the idealism of American liberalism. He is a very, very sneaky guy, very nasty. It's why he is an example of a good shapeshifter, by the way, in that if you've been following him from like his white nationalist days, like nothing fundamentally about him has really changed. It's just that he has gotten better at figuring out what actually promotes his views more. So like when he he's still a eugenicist, like fully. He just now realizes that like liberal versions of eugenicism or like progressive-ish readings of eugenicism is more attainable than like the white nationalist, like crazy blood and soil versions of eugenicism. Like, this is a horrible example of someone who represents the type of person he's trying to talk about.
Wing. The thing about him, though, is that he is basically right-wing. He used to be extremely right-wing. He renounced some of his more repugnant views and now finds himself endorsing some form of liberalism that is basically very elitist. His takes include such hits as, I naturally have fascist instincts, but I can't be a fascist because I am too smart and intellectually honest. Aesthetically, I love hierarchy, tradition, etc., but every non-liberal thinker...
He doesn't love any of this stuff, by the way. He's just lying. When he says this is what I mean, where people like, Hanania is not a dumb guy. He's not usually, I guess lying is not the right word. He is misleading people. When he says aesthetically, I love hierarchy and tradition, no, he doesn't. It's that aesthetic word is carrying the entire thing, in that hierarchy and tradition are things that motivate people to be excellent. They are things associated with the supremacy of Western tradition, of Western history or whatever, or of modernity. But like, he doesn't actually care about the like things. When we say aesthetically, we love these things. He doesn't mean what a fascist means. He means in that those are things that signal GDP and productivity and growth and capital, whatever. Like, there's a reason why he famously said he could, write a better version of a Shakespeare book if he was given a year to do it, because he doesn't value these things. He thinks everything is very material, very immediate, or whatever.
embarrassingly bad, there's no honest alternative. Or from just a few days ago, my politics are anti-populist, which kind of sounds like I'm against the average citizen, but that is not necessarily true. I see the vast majority of the public as relatively passive and uninterested in politics. This makes them mostly harmless. And this is why democracy is fine, since depending on what elites are doing, they can be led in a positive or negative direction. I guess I'm glad he
Which
spends
also
his time...
just, again, like, it's just, he's very simple when it comes to politics, too. It's just not a very accurate, it's an ill-informed sort of, like, position to take.
Complaining about right-wingers a lot these days, but liberalism is, in a very real sense, about rule by the people, and not in a, oh, I guess it's fine sense, but in a principled, a system of government is only legitimate if the people have representation sense. The consent of the governed doesn't depend...
Yeah, but, like, especially in America, it's not because, like, the people are good. It's, like, a very neutral sort of definition. Like, if you go back and read the founding fathers, like, these guys, and even Jefferson is, but like, you know, Jefferson is the outlier. Like, these guys are very suspicious of the people. They're very afraid of the mob. They're very much insistent that this, you know, sub-gentleman class is prone to really bad behavior, prone to vice, prone to short-term thinking. Like, democracy emerged not because it was like this ultimate virtue that everyone had, that you know, had to be allowed for. It's because it's almost like necessary. It's that, like, it's the ways of despotism were not sufficient, and that market conditions were sort of forcing upon this new sort of mode of political organization. Like, this is a very idealistic and very generous view of the people that I don't think is really shared by our nation's tradition.
On a utilitarian calculus. We don't all have to be Rousseau reading radicals, but if you think people are basically unimprovable hogs for whatever reason, maybe because social media has irreparably destroyed our brains, or because people are just fundamentally too stupid, whatever, I think you should probably just start doing the whole Plato philosopher king thing instead of calling yourself a liberal. Because,
like, not even, again, like, this is the problem. Like, the whole point of liberalism is that you can, like, you can address these problems in the sense where you can accept that these are real things. Like, it is the case that people are getting dumber. An example being that people are increasingly less literate in every class in America. That is a real, actual trend that is not slowing down. Like, people are getting probably significantly dumber, and it's partially from cultural trends, it's partially whatever, technology, whatever the fuck. But, like, the message to learn there, the lesson to be learned there is that, like, progress and excellence and intelligence, these are not just linear things that go up with time, that go up with technological innovation. These are things that are highly malleable, and it might be the case that for our lifetimes, we have already seen the most illiterate the American population will be. Like, these are real things that liberalism can account for. Like, you don't have to retreat to some, like, weird populist, weird philosopher king or fascistic or communist interpretation of America. America assumes the worst of most people. Like, that's the beauty of our system, is that we somehow can function with highly idealistic, highly optimistic people in a system where there is an, like, crushing amount of cynicism about how people will behave. That's the entire, I think it's the really biggest thing that sets America apart from the rest of the liberal world, is that, like, we are a nation founded in deep cynicism, in deep mistrust for our common man. But we all pretend like we're not. That's the joke of it. There's, you know, Melville wrote about that a lot, where it's like this idea that, like, you have to feign confidence in your fellow man. You have to feign this ability to see the best in people, but you're really always assuming the worst. It's a funny game we play. It's like and it's a uniquely American quality, this sort of doublespeak, this sort of constant readiness to be backstabbed. And you still see it in contemporary media. You know, you still see it in the characters like Daniel Plainview and There'll Be Blood. Like, there's nothing more American than that sort of archetype. So this is just, I don't understand why, like, I don't want to where this comes from, this idea you have to have a Rousseauian bent to appreciate American liberalism, when really Rousseau is pretty much not, like, the Rousseauian thread of liberal thought just really isn't found here. This is a Locke and Hobbes nation, buddy. Get used to
liberalism appears to be populated with all the technocrats at the moment. I think we really have no reason to be more pessimistic about the people than the early liberals were. By our standards, people were much worse back then. Lower literacy, more intolerant, mob violence. I mean, I could go on and on about this, really. We have different challenges today. Social media is one that I know a lot of you are thinking about.
The major difference is that things were much more localized back then. I think if you took the founding fathers and you showed them the complicated administrative state we have today, and how much the average person hates it while benefiting from it directly, I think they would be equally freaked out, equally pessimistic.
For good reason. All I'm saying is that we need to keep our cynicism about the people in perspective and not let it, not stew in it. That's all I'm asking. Don't stew in it. Finally, I want to address just one more problem with the liberal rejection.
I mean, that's fair. I'd say not stew in it. I disagree. I think you should stew in it, but that's a more reasonable perspective than assuming better.
Of populism, which is that it frankly just makes it hard to describe reality right now if you're too afraid of sounding like a populist. This administration is, in fact, run by a group of out-of-touch elites that are destroying the government and American society and making a lot of money in the process.
The problem with this, though, is that like this plays into anti-populism, though, which is that, hey, guys, the administrative state is the only thing holding things together right now. You see what the result of electing people on a populist mandate is. They destroy everything. Again, like it's hard to communicate that because it's hard to see that destruction because it's so abstract for even people who are educated. But like, I don't know how you'd interpret what's happening with the Trump admin and not think, hey, this is the result of populism. Again, populism is not necessarily referring to, like, I hate this term. That's why I hate the term. Elite means nothing. Like, Bill Pulte is not really an elite because he has a lot of money. He's like elite, or like in like the American traditional sense of the word, like it would be like more like gentleman. Like the gentleman class is not just dictated by your status in terms of like your economic output or your literal position. It's like all of the things that matter alongside that, the way that you're viewed, your taste, the types of people you know, the types of people you can pull on, and in what ways you can do that. Like that's what you're seeing with Trump is that the Trump administration is unique in that your proximity to Trump determines how much power you have. It determines how much sway you have. So you can be a unrepentant scammer like almost everyone in his cabinet who has no social standing at this point, but you can get away with it because you have a front row seat to this presidency, and you can talk to the director and get him to do things. You can get him to change the play. At whim, basically. So, but that in itself is like, this is populism run amok. This is listening to what the people wanted and giving it to them, and it's crazy what we have. So I don't know how you could reframe this again, you can lie, but at that point, if you reframe it, it is through lying.
That's happening. The president is shaking down private businesses, talked about going to war for oil, and the Secretary of State said that we're at war with Iran because of Israel. The president is punishing members of his own party who talk about Trump's connection with Jeffrey Epstein, who he sent an insane letter to. Remember that? Talking about all their shared secrets. The president's political allies are gaining more and more control over the nation's media, and he tries all the time to have his critics silenced. That's reality. That's what's happening. And it's not even all of it. Trump has been the establishment in politics for a decade, 10 years. It is entirely honest and correct to run a populist campaign against the corrupt establishment of the Trump administration, against everything that I just said. And we can run that populist campaign in service of advancing liberal principles. Like Lincoln said, a new birth of freedom, a new deal. That's FDR, or my favorite, Paine's belief that we have it in our power to begin the world over again. That's the end. Thanks so much, everybody. I really appreciate it.
I like this guy. I think he's cool for being as progressive as he is. I think he does something useful. I just don't understand, though, how like populism just breaks everyone's like conception of reality. Like at the end of this video, I still have no idea what he means by embracing populism beyond embracing the traditional notion of American, like, we're all, equal and freedom and fundamentals of American liberalism. Like, that's not populism. And then when he refers to the examples of like the Epstein Club, whatever, like, I still don't know, is it that you want people to lie or to create populist narratives and then just not deliver on it with policy? Because the problem with populism, which I don't think this video like went over, is that populist policies are problematic at best and destructive normally. Like, that's the issue, is that when you elect populists, you're electing the laziness that comes with populism. So like, if it was the case to say just run on populist rhetoric and then just run like a meritocratic institutionalist liberal, government like that, sure, but then like I'm confused because of the whole message of like, well, you don't have to lie like Trump, you can just tell a good story. Maybe I'm not representing this well, but like I'm kind of left with the same question, which is that like, when you say to run like a populist, when you say to employ a liberal version of populism, I don't know what that means beyond vague messaging like techniques or rhetoric deployment. Like, is there something that, like, because the reality is, like, you've had examples of liberal politicians trying to use populist rhetoric since before Trump and during Trump. The problem is the policy is what doesn't land. People did not make the connection between Biden's policy success. Like Bidenomics was an incredible success, and it did nothing for Biden reputation-wise. And that was as close as you can probably get to a like substantial, real, and effective policy platform for like, an economic program, especially in a horrible economic environment that would be connected to the goals of general populist economic sentiment, and it wasn't rewarded at all. So like that's the bigger issue, which is that like I don't feel like this video addresses the actual problem of populist politics, which is that it doesn't seem like it lands, or it doesn't seem like it fosters a high quality candidate or a high quality government, and it inspires really bad policy that the voter wants to see follow through on, even if it doesn't work, even if it's demonstrating failure. So, yeah, again, Ryan's a cool guy. This is supposed to be friendly criticism, or I guess friendly just conversation, but yeah, I'd agree, disagree. Let me know in the comments. And I know this is a little bit of like a ranty video, but I really do think this topic, it requires so much discussion at all the finer points, because I think we're getting lost in a lack of semantic clarity with these sort of discussions. But yeah, agree, disagree, comment below. Thank you.